Prince of Persia is a series of 3D platformers originally created by Jordan Mechner. Unlike other properties I've looked at, it was already well established for over a decade. From 2003 to 2005, the franchise leapt into the third dimension under the helm of Ubisoft Montreal. This trilogy is new territory for me. While I occasionally played the Sands of Time round friends' houses, I've never gotten into the series properly until now. For this retrospective, I'll be using the Trilogy re-release on the PlayStation 3. Let's jump in and take a look. Deeper into the 6th console generation, more and more franchises were starting to up their overall complexity. The PlayStation and Nintendo 64 had laid the groundwork for the third dimension, and this brought with it greater ambitions in development. One such franchise was Prince of Persia, which had already achieved a strong following with its classic 2D platforming. After a mixed response to the third entry in 1999, a more focused effort was needed. Following concept work in 2001, Ubisoft's final product was Prince of Persia: The Sands of Time, a title that electrified the gaming masses upon its 2003 release. It was met with considerable acclaim and successfully revived the franchise for the 5th generation of consoles. As its title suggests, Prince of Persia: The Sands of Time takes place in the ancient empire in the 9th century. An unnamed prince, voiced by Yuri Lowenthal, conquests with his father's armies but yearns for greater recognition. To do so, he undertakes a perilous escapade to retrieve the mythical Dagger of Time. As the Persian army's assault commences, the game's prologue is laid out. It's a well-crafted opening with simple tutorials for its in-game systems. Taking on basic human enemies is a great way of easing the player into the action, as is the platforming sequence to claim the legendary weapon. Tricked by the deceitful vizier into releasing the Sands of Time, the game officially begins with the entire palace owned by a sultan consumed and its inhabitants transformed into monsters. From a design standpoint, the Sands of Time focuses on a collection of precision-based rules that govern its 3 gameplay components: platforming, combat, and puzzle solving. It's a formula sustained across a wholly linear adventure that took me just under 6 hours to beat. On occasion you can venture into some hidden nooks and crannies to find upgrades to your health and sand powers, but otherwise the game is always pushing forward, with sand columns offering brief previews of the next area and a means to save the game. To round the base off, your source of health is fresh water, a simple yet highly effective piece of the puzzle. As the opposite to sand and a regular source of sustenance in the setting, it's a seamless integration. Moving into gameplay, I'll start with what the trilogy is best known for. You know how many modern climbing sequences are very forgiving and almost automated in their execution? They do this to keep the pacing moving towards the next big cinematic moment. Prince of Persia takes the opposite approach. It's all about making pinpoint leaps and navigating your way through each room. When you first enter a new area, the camera will pan around the environment, giving you an indication of where to go without revealing the moves you'll use to do so. As a rule, the prince can only leap in straight lines, cannot drop down to ledges or poles far below, and cannot climb surfaces when wet. Often, this gameplay facet is unforgiving, involving much trial and error, and yet it always remains rewarding when you pull it off. As you make your way through the Sultan's palace, the game's platforming challenges gradually increase in scale and complexity. It all starts with the animations. At the time of its release, the prince was the most versatile and acrobatic protagonist you could find in the AAA scene. He can leap across gaps, shimmy along ledges, balance on beams, swing on ropes and poles, and crucially, run across walls in one of the first implementations of parkour-style moves. The camera is always positioned at a good distance and can also pan out to offer a wider view, so you can always see what you're doing. It gets to a point where you'll need to work your way back through previous rooms to find another way through. Take the bathhouses for example. After initially making your way through smaller rooms to a wider area, you'll transition back through the same area at a higher elevation. You'll be making use of every move at the prince's disposal in the game's latter half, with a greater emphasis on avoiding dangerous traps. Pulling off a perfect run and slipping under a closing door with moments to spare is one of the most satisfying moments in the title. Then there's the combat, which swaps the camera to a wider view. Switching to an alternative angle with L2 is possible, but certainly not recommended as it keeps you from seeing enemy attacks. The Prince's dual wielding and acrobatics carry through into this mode as well, as he's able to flip over enemies for a lethal strike to the back. On the whole, it's all about good timing to both deliver and avoid damage. While the enemies won't all attack at once, they tend to slash at you after blocking or when you're in the middle of a combo. To defeat these mythical monsters of the sand, you'll have to knock them over, landing a finishing move with either a stab or a slick somersault strike in mid-air. The enemy can do the former to you as well, so you'll have to time leaping back to your feet. There's a surprising amount of enemy variety in the Sands of Time, and often you'll need to switch up your moves to bring them down. For the guards wielding dual lances, for example, you can't vault over them, so you'll have to dodge around their swings instead. For its time, the battles you'll face are both challenging and infused with a surprising amount of depth. There are a couple of chinks in the armour here, and this comes down to the tougher opponents. Early on in the game, you'll reach the main hall and take on the Prince's father, transformed into a hulking sand soldier. This marks the game's first spike in difficulty, and took me several tries to beat. The issue is that this boss is a damage sponge. At first I believed you had to knock him down like any other foe, but he continued to block my strikes. The only hit that broke through his defences was a leaping stab with the Dagger of Time, and I had to keep performing this attack over and over again until the boss decided he had enough. Tedious battles like these don't happen often enough to break the pacing, but it was still noticeable. Finally, we come to the puzzle solving, and this is easily the simplest aspect of the overall package. For the most part, you're asked to figure out the route out of a room through platforming, but on occasion another direction will be taken. This involves moving statues to press switches or redirecting light around a room. One of the game's earliest puzzles involves escaping a tower, complete with a guard barking instructions at you. While the voice acting can get a bit cheesy, it is a welcome reprieve from the combat and platforming. Tying all three elements together are the sand powers themselves, which form the backbone of the game's difficulty. Using the Forbidden Dagger, the Prince can slow time and immobilize enemies in combat, and most crucially of all, rewind time to correct a mistake. It was an incredibly unique gameplay facet that both took advantage of new hardware while also preserving Prince of Persia's roots. In essence, it's an additional checkpointing system, one governed by the amount of sand chambers you currently have. You can undo a platforming or combat mistake up to 6 or 7 times at full capacity, but once you're out, triggering a game over will send you back to the last save point. In hindsight, you can't help but think about Assassin's Creed when playing through the trilogy nowadays. You can clearly see the building blocks for that series on display, placed against a far more minimalistic story. In terms of presentation, it gets the job done with just a handful of rendered cutscenes and in-game moments. The voice acting stands out the most for its often corny nature. It's that awkward midpoint between the laughable dialogue of the 5th generation and the more cinematic focus of the 7th.
So if you want to live, die in love. Die in love, stay alive.
What's that supposed to mean?
I thought you'd like it.
If you want to be useful, try finding a book that'll tell us how to get out of here.
This isn't that kind of game.
Game? She thinks this is a game.
One thing that the Sands of Time does have over its successor franchise is the smaller touches. In keeping with the fairy tale nature of its story, the Prince speaks to the player after pausing, saving, or triggering a game over with the following lines.
Done. I'll start the story from here next time. Wait. That's not how it happened. Shall I go on?
In addition, the character's tunic slowly degrades over the course of the game, and by the end, he's ditched the top half entirely. These light additions allow the sense of immersion to rise, while also showing the toll the events have taken on the protagonist. All is not perfect though. The sound mixing could have used some work, particularly with regard to the voice acting and soundtrack. Sands takes some notes from Tomb Raider and keeps the adventure fairly quiet to emphasise the isolation, though on occasion it will kick things up a notch with a hybridised action piece. The Tower of Dawn, when you can hear it that is definitely the game's most well-known track. It comes into play in the game's most challenging combat sequence aboard a lift. Following this ascent, the prince and fellow survivor Farah are quickly sucked out of the tower, effectively extending the game's length by another 40 or so minutes. It's here where we come to the more surreal elements of the title. The protagonist must venture through one of 7 corridors in a specific order to find Farah. This moment sticks out from the rest of the game for how much it deviates from the regular formula. It's not quite for the best, as the endless chatter between the characters can get irritating as you figure out the order of the doorways. The brief bath scene that follows is, much like the rest of the story, suggestive rather than explicit. It's a culmination of the bond between the prince and Farah that appears to be a mere illusion. The scene complements the mystique of the setting without pulling the player out of the core gameplay for too long. Once you're out of this chamber, there's a final jaunt to the top of the tower without the sand powers to back you up. Luckily though, a powerful sword that cleaves through enemies and plentiful checkpoints ensures that things don't become too frustrating. After losing Farah and plunging the dagger back into the hourglass, the concluding battle ensues. As I mentioned before, boss fights aren't exactly a strong point in the trilogy's first act, and the Vizier is no different. It's a case of countering his attacks to wear him out and knocking out his double 3 times. Once you're out on the balcony, it only takes a few more hits to kill the traitor and thus end the game. The dagger is sealed away in the tomb and disaster is averted, a simple yet straightforward ending that resets things back to normal. When looking at the greater picture, The Sands of Time crafts a standout adventure that still holds up today. After its smashing success, sequels were inevitable. The early to mid-2000s were a time of rebellious attitudes and edgy subject matter. When it came to video games, this saw a push towards making grittier, more mature titles for the quote-unquote real gamers. It was time to up that age rating, get the bloody carnage in there, and appeal towards the older teenage demographic. As with every industry trend, this worked well for some games and less so for others. In 2003, Naughty Dog's Jak 2 Renegade took its franchise to a darker place, obtaining strong recognition in the process. Then, in 2005, Sonic Team's Shadow the Hedgehog failed miserably at getting edgy and set the mascot up for disaster. Prince of Persia: Warrior Within, released in 2004, sits between those two titles for me. While aspects of its aesthetic haven't aged too well, it progresses forward very well as a sequel. Warrior Within begins with one of the wildest tone shifts I've ever seen in a game. 7 years after the prince sealed away the sands of time, he finds himself pursued by a dark force. Aiming to change his fate, he journeys to the source of the mythical elements, only to be attacked by an undead force led by a woman warrior in skimpy black armour. It's insane. Within the first minute, the prince is decapitating enemies, taunting them in battle, and most notably, everything about the game is louder, gorier, and more intense than the original, immediately hammering the game's focus onto the player. Adding to this is a new voice cast. The prince is voiced by Robin Atkin-Downes this time around, who goes for a more serious, unflinching portrayal. The prince is knocked into the ocean by his opponents, and the game begins in earnest. We find ourselves at the Fortress of Time, a gothic, labyrinthine setting that couldn't be any more different from the Sultan's palace. It's very vampiric in appearance, with a heavy use of black and red in the early levels. From the word go, the prince is all alone on his harrowing quest. As he makes his way inside, the game's new format becomes clear. The setting is sundered into past and present, and you'll be travelling through both of them via these sand portals, which give way to a non-linear structure. As the prince steps between times, a simple cutscene masks the load times between the two, and you'll also be bestowed with new abilities upon each transition. This new method of progression was a double-edged sword for me. On the one hand, it deepens the Fortress of Time and emphasises the prince's solitude, but on the other, it makes navigation a little confusing at times. You can pull up a map to point you to the current objective, but if you're not careful, you may end up going round in circles within the wrong period. Generally, if the camera pans to a point of interest like it did previously, or new enemies spawn, you're going in the right direction. Though with that said, you will have to fight the same adversaries at several intervals throughout. In the present, the fortress is in ruin, with many paths sealed off. Go to the past, however, and you'll discover alternative ways through. Early on, you'll be introduced to Kylena, voiced by Monica Bellucci, probably the most seductive voice they could find in hindsight. There's also a strange spectre watching the prince from afar before disappearing from view. The Empress of the fortress is clashing with the lieutenant you met in the opening, and the prince jumps in for a rematch. While the cast of Warrior Within is very small, the lieutenant known as Shadi is by far the weakest element. After taking her down, I completely forgot about her presence in the story. That just makes her appeal to teenage boys that much more evident. This isn't the story's only issue. In terms of presentation, the game relies a lot more on in-game cutscenes to carry things along, and the character expressions can look rather dopey at many points. This was a product of the time, but the sands of time got by with fewer of these awkward interludes. The established traversal mechanics continue to play a major role, with the prince now able to slide down banners for an easy shortcut. You'll find yourself tested by the many traps and hazards which now require much better timing to avoid. When getting into the meat of the package, Warrior Within's difficulty is immediately apparent, with normal mode being no slouch. You're going to get your ass kicked a lot in this title, and it comes down mainly to countless changes in the combat. Not only is there more of it, but several systems have been condensed. Let's break it down. Checkpoints are fewer in number and less forgiving, enemies are far more aggressive, you have a lower sand tank capacity, the prince can't rewind back as far as he could in the previous game, the window for countering attacks is far slimmer, and finally, traps and bosses now do far more damage. To counteract these dangers, the prince now has a full combo system alongside a dual-wielding mechanic to tackle the fights. With a tap of circle, you'll hold on to a secondary weapon until it breaks, and this makes your attacks much stronger for a brief period. On top of that, the environment plays a greater role as you can swing round poles for an unblockable strike. In keeping with tradition, enemies also have their own deadlier attacks. These assassins can latch onto the prince from behind, and undead dogs can attack and dodge away quickly. It can become incredibly brutal. Battles become more of an endurance test as you go on, and every precious water basin becomes a much needed reprieve. At points I even stumbled across exploits like this one in the library. You can lure the enemy inside the bookcases to take them out one at a time. As the game progresses, the prince also gains some super attacks to even the odds. He can either enter rage mode for a vicious assault, or trigger a time explosion that severely damages enemies in his radius. Bosses also make a return, and they're far better implemented than previously. For starters, they're clearly defined with a health bar this time, and also vary up the gameplay. For example, when taking on a titan, you must leap on top of them for extra damage while avoiding their grabs. These bigger beasts bring to mind the original God of War, which came out 1 year later, especially with an arc griffin that attacks in the ruins of the Empress's throne room. Combat may be deeper, but it's not without problems, most notably the sheer amount of it that goes hand in hand with the darker tone. It seems every 10 minutes you hear the rock guitar kick in and it's time to slice up some monsters. Repetitive sound effects from both the prince and his enemies can grow tiresome, and often the platforming will come to a stop as you fight your way through. This does come at the expense of puzzles, which are far less frequent than they were before. Often it's a case of moving a box onto a switch here and breaking a wall there to proceed. You'll also be slowing time to slip under doorways before they close. Despite its intent on creating a foreboding setting, the environments in Warrior Within still have their moments. Rewinding back to the past and discovering a beautifully lit garden, or fighting your way through a giant clock mechanism are some of the biggest highlights through its runtime. The latter is especially effective, involving scaling up the gears before cranking them into place, all while defeating creatures who cross your path. Finally, we have the Dahaka, the prince's ever-present demonic nemesis who is based off the Zahak from Iranian mythology. You can't fight this monster, you can only run, with instant death if you fail to escape. The Dahaka, more than anything else, embodies the hardcore heavy metal vibe of the game with its growling voice and weighty approach. It gets the player to use what they've learned at a much faster pace. Whenever it shows up, Warrior Within brings in a thunderous piece which heightens the thrill of the chase. As anyone who played it knows, hard rock and metal is the central anchor of the title's aesthetic. Stuart Chatwood stayed on as composer, and the result is a lesser focus on traditional Arabian instruments. While I mentioned the soundtrack can grow repetitive over time, it still complements the action well. After activating 2 towers to unlock the central throne room, the prince duels with Kylina. While you may think this signifies the game's conclusion, it only complicates things even more for him. Continuing to be chased by the Dahaka, it turns out that he himself created the Sands of Time. By killing the Empress in the past, her remains poured into the hourglass and his life debt remains unpaid. This is a pivotal moment for the protagonist, and Robin Atkin Downes really sells it. No longer is the prince a naive soldier who made a mistake. Instead, he now feels a great despair over his actions. It's easily the story's finest hour. Having quite literally hit rock bottom, our hero must dig his way out of the hole he has dug for himself. In its final moments, Warrior Within boasts a clever reversal of events, and it all starts when the protagonist dons the mask of the Wraith, allowing him to change his own timeline. The prince is transformed into a darker, more supernatural version of himself for a spell, and this brings with it another gameplay shift. While your sand tanks constantly regenerate, the prince's health is slowly draining away, though luckily for the purpose of fairness, it won't outright kill him if you don't rush through the levels. As you make your way back through the fortress on a different path, it turns out that figure the regular prince saw was himself all along, a very effective means to craft the final act. You'll travel through locales both old and new in a desperate bid to alter events. Eventually, the prince transforms back and you return to the present for the climax. It was at this point that I realised Warrior Within had 2 different conclusions. The good ending requires the player to search the entire castle and obtain every health upgrade alongside the water sword. Only through this exploring can you finally take revenge on the Dahaka for all the hell he put you through. Failing this, you'll be fighting Kylina for a second time, this time to the death. It's a grueling fight thanks to the Empress's speed and blocking, but her most dangerous move is using the Sands of Time against you. When this happens, you have no defense outside of rewinding time or initiating your super attacks, which drain your valuable sand tanks. After dying multiple times, I found out you could hang off the edge of the arena and wait for the time dilation to end. Claiming victory, the prince guts his red-robed opponent, and her body is taken by the Dahaka instead of the protagonist. Regardless of which ending you get, the final shot of Warrior Within remains the same. The prince, with Kylina at his side in the canon ending, returns to find his home engulfed in flames. Based on the protagonist's actions in both games, a new timeline has emerged, setting the stage for the final game in the trilogy. Ultimately, Warrior Within is a solid sequel. Its tone has its iffy moments and the combat can get a little tiresome, but the additions it makes go a long way to make up for it. For the 3rd chapter, Ubisoft Montreal attempted to fuse the 2 styles together. In spite of its relatively sound critical reception, the more adult-oriented style of Warrior Within didn't sit well with everyone. Even the franchise's creator voiced some disapproval towards it. In 2005, the 6th generation of game consoles was starting to wind down, and the Prince of Persia trilogy did so along with it. Ubisoft chose to maintain the more violent side they had established, while returning to the exotic storybook elements of the original title. The result was Prince of Persia: The Two Thrones, a capable finale with the occasional new idea that didn't work out too well. The Two Thrones doesn't wait long to cast aside the serious tone of its predecessor. The prince and Kylina are attacked immediately by Babylon's invaders on their arrival. The Empress is dragged off by soldiers and our hero gives chase. This serves as both the opening prologue and the first indication that this 3rd entry is moving back towards the tone and themes of the Sands of Time. Yuri Lowenthal reprises the role, and the edgier tone has been heavily dialed back. Just like the opening assault on the Maharaja's palace in Sands of Time, you're taking on regular foes at the outset. Who is their leader? It's the Vizier, of course. Having never been killed in the current timeline, he's back to seize control. The prince is too late to save Kylina as she is stabbed with the Dagger of Time, releasing the sands once again. This time around, the protagonist himself is infected, splitting into 2 forms at odds with each other. Washed out to the city outskirts, he must fight his way back inside and put an end to the chaos. Kylina becomes the narrator of this story, and the returning 4th war breaks once again ground the title.
I am happy to wait. I have all the time in the world. Is this where I should resume the tale next time? No, no, no. That is not how it happened.
Battling across Babylon gives way to a full-on city environment, one that would lay the groundwork for Ubisoft's next major franchise. To keep with the console hardware of the time, Most of it is dead or deserted, with the occasional civilian surviving in the background. It's a subtle hint that the prince's subjects are in an equally grim struggle, something that will carry through into a later reveal. Unlike the many winding corridors of past games, The Two Thrones is all about alleyways and rooftops, which both make for great environments to fight and platform through. It's very well paced as you press on through both interior and exterior sections of the city. All of it definitely continues the same solid presentation, with a few added bells and whistles. Character models have received an uplift in detail, and are now more expressive than they ever were before. This runs alongside another return. Farah is back, armoured up and ready for action. She once again joins the prince in his mission, and this time the banter between them reaches a much more likeable and charismatic level.
He murdered my father, enslaved my people, imprisoned me, and all in the name of becoming some kind of god.
I know too well what he is capable of, but I intend to find him and punish him for what he has done to my kingdom.
You are the son of Shahraman, the Prince of Persia?
And you are the daughter of the Maharaja. We both seek the same thing. Perhaps we should journey together.
Perhaps. Provided you can keep up.
Over time, our protagonist moves beyond fighting for himself and starts to care more for those he rules over. This compels the player to push on, despite the title being shorter than its predecessors. The one major element that did carry over from Warrior Within is its split between light and dark. Much like the Mask of the Wraith, the prince's infection aims to raise the stakes for the protagonist's ultimate test. From a gameplay standpoint, this new Dark Prince is a solid continuation that further expands the combat. But from a story and thematic viewpoint, I was left wanting more. Much like the black-suited Spider-Man, the Dark Prince offers a more foreboding side to the protagonist. His skin turns black, and the razor-sharp chain painfully wrapped around his left arm becomes a versatile tool in platforming and battle. The overarching issue is that it doesn't amount to much thematically. A voice inside the prince's head will comment on in-game events quite frequently, but it doesn't go any further than that. The developers could have gone the extra mile here and distorted the environments as well. They had already done something similar with Warrior Within's move between past and present. This is something that would have heightened the prince's internal struggle as he loses his grip on reality. As it stands, this element of the story comes off as rather basic. Rather than being confined to one section, the Dark Prince ebbs in and out of the proceedings at specific intervals. Through an often abrupt transition, the sands flare up inside our hero, leaving his health slowly ticking away. Reaching a pool of water reverts the prince back to normal. Unfortunately for you, the player, dropping to zero now results in instant death, so you need to not only make it through to the next water source, but do it as quickly as possible. Collecting the sands of time can refill your health in a pinch, but otherwise you'll be hurrying things along. As the platforming challenges become more difficult, you'll be tested just as much as you were in the other titles, and this comes to a head towards the end of the game when the prince is knocked into a deep well. What this split personality does do is deliver a healthy amount of new moves across both platforming and combat. While mostly the same as its predecessor, The Two Thrones makes efforts to broaden the gameplay for the trilogy's conclusion. On his light side, the prince can now latch onto holes in the wall, leap at an angle, and use narrow gaps to ascend or descend, whereas with the dark side it's all about the chain lashed around him. In addition to swinging across gaps and extending wall runs, it plays a major role in battles. The returning combo system allows him to perform tremendously acrobatic attacks that can make short work of most enemies. Unlike the drastic difficulty boost of Warrior Within, you won't find yourself struck down as often here. This is mostly down to enemy attacks being slightly slower and less frequent. It's still a challenge on normal, but you'll find things slightly easier for sure. Equally engaging are the returning puzzle sections. In terms of quantity, the amount falls in between Sands of Time and Warrior Within. It's all about scale at these moments as you operate machinery to move objects. Rotating a large statue to rescue some trapped Babylonians is very rewarding to solve, as is shifting platforms later on, though in terms of gameplay balance there could have been one or two more. In a bid to go beyond established formula, The Two Thrones introduces a couple of new gameplay scenarios. I'll start with the most overt addition. What you notice about the boss fights this time around is how distinctive they all are. Some fare better than others, but there was a real effort to diversify the larger scale encounters. The first creature you'll face is a monstrous behemoth 5 times your size, and unfolds in several stages. By doing so, the prince's more cunning side comes into play, as does a hybrid between leaping and sword swinging. To start, you'll need to blind the giant by ascending to the top. Then, you'll bring him to his knees by attacking the legs. Finally, you'll finish the job by climbing up his back, dodging grabs along the way. It's a daunting encounter that stacks the odds against the prince, but not every boss fight fully engages. This dark seductress is a case of stop and start, as she leaps between 4 buildings. Surprisingly, she goes down very easily once the Dark Prince transformation takes place. Further down the road, you'll battle 2 strong warriors at once, and this is one of the hardest fights in the game. You'll need to bait the axe wielder into attacking, while simultaneously avoiding the swings of his sword-wielding partner. Thanks to the different foes and required tactics, the boss fights in this third entry are easily the best of the bunch. Speed kills and chariot racing make up the rest of the package. One is a good addition, the other not so much. Stealth plays a bigger role than it did previously. When you enter a new area, you'll often find yourself descending downwards with the ability to land lethal backstabs. This triggers a series of quick-time events depending on the enemy. Success means you can stay hidden. Failure means you're immediately discovered. This goes hand in hand with the new sand portals. Enemy reinforcements can pour in if you're discovered. You can kill the red guards to prevent this, but you'll have to be very quick. Despite being an elaborate QTE, the animations are still on top form. The contrast between light and dark Prince, in terms of how brutal he is with the executions, is a great touch. Then there are the chariots, and these are easily the weakest moments in the 2 thrones. They're very basic in design, a case of manoeuvring round obstacles and slicing off would-be hijackers. It's true that they don't last very long, but the constant screen shake and quick deaths were rather frustrating when they showed up. Across all gameplay styles, the rewind function persists, allowing you to correct any kind of mistake, and you can still head off the beaten path for some health upgrades and sand credits for further unlockables. As you head towards the end of the game, things come to a head for not only the Prince and Farah, but the entire city. Unlike previously when he was taking on adversaries himself, the whole city rises up in defiance. It's a suitably awesome cinematic that really hammers home the finality of the proceedings. In keeping with its more urban style, the music of the 2 thrones also rises to the occasion. Stuart Chatwood was joined by the very skilled Inon Zur to make the longest soundtrack yet. The return of Arabian percussion and choir voices is much welcomed, and on the whole it's much more varied and dynamic, shifting to match the mood of regular combat, boss fights, and the Dark Prince's encroaching presence. Aiming to capture the 2 sides, several pieces of music will shift between the Prince's forms, thus matching the game's sense of duality. Again, just like in the Sands of Time, the 2 thrones features a climb up the tallest tower with vast views stretching out before the player. This time it's the Hanging Gardens of Babylon that serve the climactic backdrop. It's a solid mix of both climbing and moving weighted blocks to progress higher and higher. At the peak, the Vizier issues his ultimatum with a 3-stage battle. Initially, it's straightforward strikes against the monster. If you get the timing right here, you can blast through without letting the Vizier get a single hit on you. Next up, there's navigating between a whirlwind of rubble to latch onto the boss. This can get tricky with him constantly flying between the pillars. For a dramatic finish, the prince climbs to the very top of floating rubble and lands his killing blow. It's too bad that the platforming segment leading up to it is incredibly fiddly. You've got to climb up narrow platforms while the Vizier takes aim at you. Odds are most of your sand tanks were drained in the second stage of the fight, and if you're on a swinging pole for too long, it's essentially instant death. While the environment's never adapted to show the Dark Prince's intrusion, The concluding section of the Prince of Persia trilogy does make an impression. Wandering through the prince's mind to confront his dark side is far more engaging than the corridors at the end of the Sands of Time. In some ways, it feels like an inspiration for the Animus in Assassin's Creed. The shifting platforms and celestial background make for a visually appealing backdrop. Fighting the many copies of the Dark Prince yields no victory. Instead, it's all about leaving him behind, rejecting the greatest of urges. You climb the stairs to return to reality and reach the ending. The prince has defeated his enemies, won the respect of his people, and overcome the darkness within him. As Kylina's spirit takes the dagger for the last time, everything is nicely wrapped up. What I appreciated most about the Two Thrones as a whole was how it brings everything full circle. The last shot of the prince telling his story to Farah at the top of Babylon is the perfect send-off. With this conclusive ending, the glory days of the franchise were officially over. 2 years later, Ubisoft released the first Assassin's Creed, which would go on to become the corporation's premier franchise. From then on, the Persian prince was seemingly no longer needed. The fate of Prince of Persia is an interesting one to say the least. It didn't fizzle into obscurity. Instead, several efforts were made to continue the property, kicking off with Prince of Persia in 2008. This effort to bring the series into the HD era may have offered a stunning art style, but it would also do away with the challenging gameplay in favour of something more automated and casual. When Assassin's Creed 2 rocked the gaming masses in 2009, Ubisoft's priorities quickly shifted. Yet, a final attempt manifested itself with Prince of Persia: The Forgotten Sands in 2010, which carried through into a wider multimedia push. While it did return to the franchise's roots, the series had already been massively eclipsed. Even the release of a feature film based on the Sands of Time couldn't raise further interest in the series. I watched the film recently and I found it to be incredibly mediocre, a mostly by-the-numbers Hollywood blockbuster that blends in with all the rest, despite a talented cast. Now, after more than a decade of absence, Ubisoft is bringing the series back with a remake that looks like a bit of an afterthought. It was due to come out today on March 18, 2021, but was recently delayed indefinitely. Can it revitalise the franchise? The answer is hiding away in the sandstorm of real-world events. Thanks for watching. Playing through the Prince of Persia trilogy was very enjoyable for the most part, with the Sands of Time scoring the highest for me. Which game in the trilogy was your favourite? Would you like the series to make a full comeback? Let me know in the comments below. You can follow my work and blog at the links in the description.